Okay, good morning again, everyone. As I said earlier, my name is Jade Williams. I am the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice, and you are here to participate today in our Climate Justice Workshop. So today we have a couple of presentations. We have a couple of presentations. So we are going to be starting out with Ms. Mikel Jackson, who will give us our introduction and also tell us a little bit about JFJ's work in climate justice so far. We will also have a presentation from Senator Fraser Binns, who will talk a little bit about her role in the climate fight as the Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change. Then I will go ahead and do a presentation as well. I'm going to be speaking about our situational analysis of access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters. So that is a research paper that JFJ would have commissioned a year or so ago. And it gave us some key findings about the way people are perceiving themselves and their lives to their environment. So we'll discuss some of those findings in my presentation. We'll then be joined by Ms. Nastasia Robinson, who will be delivering a presentation on bauxite mining and solid waste disposal around the legislative framework of those areas. And so basically what exists now, and maybe identifying as well some of the gaps in those areas. We will then have Ms. Teresa Rodriguez Moody, who is the CEO of the Jamaica Environment Trust and one of our partners at JFJ in our climate justice efforts. And she will be delivering a presentation on the impact of the bauxite alumina industry on the communities that rely on the Rio Cobre. As I'm sure some of us who have joined would have recognized that that is a topical issue that has even had some recent developments. So Teresa would shed some light on that for us. So we were to be also joined by Mr. Ronzoni Rainford from the JFJ team, but I am sending apologies for him. Unfortunately, he's quite ill. So I will try to subsume some of his points in my presentation, and then we will have Ms. Vanessa Parkinson closing out the session. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again for joining us on time. And I will ask Ms. Jackson to go ahead and make her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I trust we're doing well on this beautiful Tuesday morning. My name is Mikel Jackson, Executive Director for JFJ. I want to start by extending my own appreciation to Senator Sophia Fraser Binns, opposition spokesperson on land and environment. And I believe she hails from the Garden Parish of St. Anne like myself, so we can claim her in that regard as well. And certainly Dr. Teresa Rodriguez Moody, CEO of Jamaica Environment Trust, a partner agency with Jamaicans for Justice, Ms. Nastasia Robinson, attorney at law, and a family member within the JFJ team. Special appreciation to the three of you, and certainly Jade Williams, our policy and advocacy specialist. Thanks so much to all those who have registered and will join us, and to those on the call now. So just to shed some light on the work of Jamaicans for Justice, I know many persons are aware of our work around citizen security, crime, and those particular more frontal issues that you perhaps would hear in the news, our position on the state of public emergency. Others perhaps may be aware, but just for information, that JFJ, we started in 1999 amidst the then gas riots of the country. And our work evolved, again, as I mentioned just now, citizen security. And our work also focuses on child rights with a particular focus on those in state care, which is why perhaps some of you would have heard us speaking on the recent happenings with the Child Protection and Family Services Agency. A lot of you may not know that JFJ, we have a strong program area around gender-based violence. So persons who are survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, then we also lend some support in that area. And of course, broad areas of discrimination. Perhaps you would have recalled my predecessor, Roger Malcolm, speaking extensively and advocating on matters such as corporal punishment, for example, discrimination when it comes to grooming policies within the school environment. So those are some of the broad focal areas, or focus areas rather, of JFJ. Now, you can appreciate that as an organization focused on human rights, we get daily calls around different matters of injustices that our Jamaican population are facing. And one of those matters that we have been getting for years now, land dispute, for example, persons believing that environmental malpractices are affecting their different human rights. And over the years, we started paying attention to some of those complaints. Rather than saying this is not a thematic area of the organization, we looked at it and say, this is something that requires a little bit more hands-on approach, because we are aware of the great work being done by JET and others. But in terms of that access to legal services, we felt that there was a gap that perhaps JFJ could lend some support to. Now, in late 2019, through grant support from the Open Society Foundation, JFJ started providing support in the area of climate justice and in environmental rights. And I think it's important that we make an early distinction between the two. Because when you look at climate justice, you're talking about how marginalized populations, for example, are able to respond to climate changes. You know, we live in a tropical zone that are susceptible to certain shocks, for example, hurricanes and so on. So we ask ourselves, how are the resources from the state being disseminated? How are persons who live in a particular area being treated and responded to in times of emergency? So we look at that lens when we talk about the climate component and how we respond to shocks from the marginalized populations. But our work also spans importantly around environmental rights. And these are some of the man-made issues, if you will. How is the state? How are some of the private sector organizations? Case in point of topic right now with ALCO, for example, employing good practices. We are all alarmed, for example, with the Rio Cobra issue. One of the areas that we have touched on from JFJ is what is happening in the bauxite mining areas. How are the practices of these private sector being enforced? How is the government enforcing some of the laws that they have? What is the strength of the legislative framework? So since 2019, 2020, JFJ has done a lot of work around this particular area. We actually commissioned 3 pieces of policy research paper. And these policy research paper examine the environmental impact laws that we have, the framework, the legislative framework, because we don't have an EIA law per se, but we have different pieces of legislation that will be focusing on different aspects of it. When you talk about an environmental impact assessment, we found gaps, for example, that the communities weren't being engaged to participate. They weren't being notified in some of the instances. So we looked at those legislative framework, the gaps within it. This particular research that Jade spoke of earlier, it's one of our flagship research that really sheds some light in terms of how people feel about bauxite mining, the economic aspects of it, versus in some instances, persons said that they were being threatened if it is that they spoke out against what was happening within the communities. So outside of the policy research work that we did several community interventions. Last year, some of you may recall that we launched our Justice for All campaign, and a part of that campaign initiative was going out within the communities, interacting with the citizens within these areas, getting a sense of how they feel about it, and the issues that they are facing. Tied to that, though, we did what we call our legal literacy trainings, and those legal literacy training really educated the population about their right to a safe and healthy environment, their right to property, and how it is that they can exercise those rights within the context of the environment. Last year, some of you may recall, for example, the United Nations seeing right to a safe and healthy environment as a human right, and Jamaica has that within its constitution. So embedded in our legal literacy session is educating the population about this. We created several IEC information, education, and communication materials, for example, brochures that people can get a sense of what are these rights, how can I have these rights enforced if they are breached, what are the roles of the different state agencies. So you explain the role of a NEPA as a regulatory body, for example. Is NEPA fulfilling some of its duties? These are some of the conversations that we have within the communities. Underpinning all of that is what we do from our legal side of the work, legal advice and possible representation. So since the commencement of this particular project, we have had over 50 persons, 57 complaints coming into the organization of persons saying within the Rio Cobra community, I believe that my fundamental rights were breached based on the malpractices of Windalco, based on the inaction of the government, based on the injustices when you think about the compensation. The money is not necessarily going to all the persons that were affected. When you listen to NEPA, for example, saying that some of the compensatory framework wasn't even considered at the time when they were thinking through what exactly can they draw down on Windalco in terms of compensation to persons who were affected. So that is something that we're also pursuing. When we look at the bauxite mining areas down by Gibraltar, for example, you're seeing dust nuisance. Those are some of the critical complaints that persons, I don't want to go too much into the data, but these are some of the complaints that persons are having: medical issues, their livelihoods affected. I'm from St. Anne, so I know very well the red dirt aspects of what's happening in that particular area. So JFJ has been providing critical legal advice to the population. One of the things that we can appreciate, though, that spans with any possible legal case is that persons say that I have this complaint, but when you explain the court process, explain to them the long time that it may take to actually get some compensation from the state, then persons may say, I don't want to proceed with the matter, or I think it's going to be too long of a journey, or you explain to them the evidence that is required. You need to go to the doctor, for example, to secure some evidence that you have been affected medically. So persons, it's a journey, if you will, from a JFJ standpoint in explaining these legal procedures to potential clients for them to uptake the legal work. But we do have some clients who are willing to go the long haul, and you will be hearing much more of that. Because there are potential legal matters, we can't go into detail, but the public can be rested assured that JFJ will be pushing ahead in some of these areas, of course, in partnership with JET in particular, as I mentioned before. So that is just a quick and dirty summary of our work in climate and environmental justice. And again, I want to reiterate that we do work in both, but with a particular focus currently on an environmental aspect in terms of some of the man-made challenges that we're having. It will be remiss of me before I close in not acknowledging that part of the reason that JFJ is also working within the cockpit environment is because of our colonial history. Who are the residents that live down here? You're talking about the Maroons, for example. So any disruption to their natural environment, you're talking about their cultural rights also being eroded. And that is something that we also have to pay particular focus to, the far-reaching implications of environmental practices and the bauxite mining areas. So I just want to plug that particular area, and I hope that the speakers here will be talking in greater detail about the importance of the cultural practices of the Maroon community when I talk about the environmental malpractices and the climate injustices that we see happening in the country. And though the government is trying to fix some of these things legislatively, the question is it enough? Are we moving with some sort of alacrity that we can rest assured of what is happening? And I just want to stop there so I don't go too much into the presentations, but I hope persons have gotten a good idea of the work that JFJ is doing in this regard. Thank you so much. Jade, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mikkel. Yes, I also hope that persons got a good idea of what JFJ's work is. in this regard, absolutely. So next up on our agenda to make a presentation this morning is Senator Fraser Binns. So I'll ask her to go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Jade. Good morning, everyone. Let me just state how very pleased I am to be a part of this panel. I see Dr. Theresa Moody there. Morning, Theresa, and my very dear friend, Emma Lewis. It is in fact an honor for me to be here today to just share my own thoughts with you in terms of the topic I was given, which is climate justice and the state. And you will forgive me if I put things within context, because I think before we can talk about this role of the state, then it's important for all of us to have an understanding and an appreciation for what is climate justice. And I'll be very brief in giving what perhaps can be deemed a definition. But Daisy Simon states that climate justice begins with the idea that adverse impacts of a warming climate are not felt equitably among people. So when we think of climate justice, the following considerations readily come to mind. One, that there is a recognition that key groups are differently affected by climate change. And Mikhail, in her opening, spoke about the Maroons. But I also I agree, and I want to expand that to other groups such as the poor, women, the younger generation, and particularly those in the developing countries. And in a nutshell, we could all say that the South, the small island developing states are in fact more impacted by the effects of climate change. The other thing of note is that climate impacts exacerbate inequitable social conditions. So we know that the poor and the vulnerable are the first to suffer, and they're the ones who are hit the worst. People of color, the disabled, and I mentioned earlier, young and women. What is clear though, and even having this workshop today is testament to that there's a momentum that is building as relates to climate justice and finding solutions. And this is because people are becoming more and more aware of their rights and how the effect of climate change is impacting their lives. And they're seeking restitution for their communities, for themselves, and certainly for their countries. And it is within this context that the topic of loss and damage gives birth. And I will not delve a lot into it, but sufficient to say that there is no clear definition of loss and damage. But what we do know is that loss and damage essentially refers to the destructive effects of climate change that normally cannot be mitigated by adaptation. And when one considers this, then the question then is, what is the government? And when I say government, I'm not speaking about the existing government solely. I'm talking about successive governments. What is it that governments have been doing in Jamaica to assist the process of climate justice? And in my invitation letter, I was asked to speak briefly about what my administration has done. And so as not to politicize the discourse, I will only say that under former Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller, there was a recognition that climate change and effects is real. And that, in my mind, gave rise to why she created the ministry with responsibility for climate change. In fact, it was the first time in the history of Jamaica that such a ministry was established as a recognition of the existential threat that climate change poses for Jamaica. But outside of that, we have to consider in a global way, what are the existing frameworks in Jamaica, whether there are gaps, and how do we as a country can ensure we have a vigorous framework for climate justice. And if one is to be objective, then there is no denying that our existing framework, whether it's a legal framework or a social framework or a moral, financial, or political framework, that there is in fact a deficit when it comes on to how we treat with issues of climate justice. It is because of this why I believe that what is required is modern policies, modern laws, and ongoing public education and engagement to ensure that more persons become aware. As a small island developing state, Jamaica does not have the financial cushion to adequately deal with the effects of climate change. And we all know this. I mean, we already every year in February, March, when we start the budget debate, we see different ministries and agencies competing to see who can get the bulk of the budget, whether it's going to be national security, whether it's going to be health or education. There's always a competition to see which ministry can get the bulk of the budget. But what we do not see is a cry for the ministry with responsibility for environment to get the bulk of the budget. And I've said in several fora that unless and until we prioritize in a railway, starting with the finances, the issue of the environment and climate change, then all the other ministries, really the work that they're doing will not be long lasting, because if we do not have a safe environment, then we will not have education, we will not have health, and the list goes on. So therefore, as a country, as we contemplate climate justice, and in order for us to be effective, it is our submission that we need to take a human rights-based approach to the environment and climate change. And I was very heartened to hear Michael spoke about the rights and human rights, because in my mind, I believe that if the state is to truly be an advocate, or if the state is truly to advocate for climate justice or to facilitate climate justice, then it has to take a human rights approach. It has to recognize the rights of every single person in Jamaica to a clean and a healthy environment that is enshrined in our Constitution. So human rights refer to the freedoms and liberties which are inherent to all human beings, and no person shall be arbitrarily deprived of these rights. It is my view that in taking a human rights approach to the environment, we have to start with an acceptance that much of the rights that we have, much of the rights that we enjoy are really impacted by who we are and where we live and what you're exposed to, where we can play, where we can work. And as we consider climate justice and the role of the state, then we must ask ourselves whether there are things or actions that have been done by the state, whether directly or have been sanctioned by the state, that have environmental impact, which affects persons' human rights. And if one is to be honest, the unequivocal answer is yes. And so climate justice has to start with an acceptance that the state has not always been the agent to uphold all our rights when it comes down to environment and environment protection. So we then have to roll back, draw a line and say, how do we move forward, ensuring that these rights of our humans, of our persons in Jamaica, are protected. And I will not get into the detail because I know that there's a particular presentation on the extractive industry. But if one is to look at the extractive industry, for example, then many of our people are suffering from the destruction caused by this industry. They face dislocation, damaged home, disrupted livelihoods, ill health caused by the dust nuisance, and poor air quality. The destruction of our vital forest reserves of the cockpit country for mining threatens our underground water and our cultural integrity of the indigenous and their rights for survival. Therefore, any progressive government that is serious about giving effect to climate justice using a rights-based approach would ensure that where there are environmental breaches, the victims are adequately compensated socially, economically, financially, as a means of returning normalcy to people's lives and livelihood. And there is, in fact, a discussion to be had about what transpired late last year, in terms of the Rio Cobre and how the matter was treated with, but also the inefficiencies that were highlighted by the minister in terms of the environmental bond. And I will not go any further, but certainly a conversation can be had about climate justice and how serious we are as a country using the Rio Cobre situation as a guide. Climate justice, which is about compensating for loss as far as money can do so, requires that governments undertake all scientific and other studies required to make decisions in the best interest of citizens. Therefore, when it comes on to the extractive industry, again, there has been several calls, excuse me. There has been several calls by different groups for an impact assessment study to be done to see the effect of the extractive industry on not just the economy, but on the lives and the livelihood, on the health of persons. And climate justice and a rights-based approach would dictate that such a thing is done and done in the shortest time. Therefore, climate justice properly implemented and operationalized would cause for the government to undertake this study to see the effect of the extractive industry on people's life. Then within the concept of climate justice and the state, one can't help but to have a conversation about the legislative and the regulatory framework that exists. And it is very clear that there has been and continues to be significant deficit in this area. And as we contemplate loss and damage and climate justice and the required framework for its workability, we must of necessity require stronger legislative and enforcement framework. So we can't help but to look at the NRCA Act. And, you know, I will not get into the detail, but we all know the limitations and the deficit and how outdated that act is. And we're not limiting the review to just the fines. We saw what happened with the rare cobra fish kill and the minister's statement that there was no provision in the bond for how to treat with the effects on the residents. And this is something that climate justice would require deep concentration, consideration, and of course, for provisions to be made. Secondly, as we look at the legislative framework and climate justice from the state, I have to say that one of the things that would be required is a special tribunal or a division of the court charged with dealing with environmental matters. Now, Mikhail, you mentioned earlier that when you go into the field and you talk to persons, one of the concerns they have is that the length of time before the matter can be resolved, and that in and of itself is a turnoff. No, we believe that with the growing interest and knowledge that persons have about their rights and the redress that can be had, then environmental matters cannot be treated in the regular court system for various reasons. But what is required is a designated court or an arm of the court to deal specifically with environmental matters. The very nature of environmental matters require that they are dealt with alacrity and that they do not languish through the court system for 3 or 4 years, as we have seen with other matters. Then continuing on the regulatory and the legislative framework is there has to be a broad-based review of NEPA. NEPA is the government, and I like to use the term, the government ombudsman, the environmental ombudsman. This is the body charged by the government, or this is the government's body charged with responsibility of maintaining the environment or protecting the environment. And we all know that to a large extent, NEPA has failed in undertaking this mandate. NEPA needs to be reimagined and reignited for the greatness of the environment. There needs to be a separate act dealing with the NRCA. And some of the things that must be highlighted or provided in the act has to do with NEPA being a standalone agency, not housing any specific ministry, or the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, because we do know that conflicts will happen between the environment and the economic growth of the country and development. And we are not against development because we understand that development must take place because we all have to survive and we have that right of survival. But what we have seen in the past is that whenever a decision has to be made by the minister charged with the responsibility for the environment, that the decision has always come down in favor of the economy rather than the environment. And so to prevent such a situation from happening, we believe that NEPA should be a standalone ministry, but also that if and when NEPA's decision should be overridden, then those decisions should be done through a very thorough and engaging process where each party also have an opportunity to make their contribution and share their views. So NEPA therefore has to be given its independence. The other thing as well has to do, and I will not delve on this because this has been discussed in the public on numerous occasions, is that the penalties are simply just not significant enough to act as a deterrent. And the environmental impact assessment. We all know that as it is now, NEPA decides when to give an EIA. But even in the situation when an EIA is done, there is no mandatory consultation that is required. And as we contemplate climate justice, then as a state, we have to ensure that everybody has an opportunity for their voice to be heard. And so there ought to be a right, a legislated right to consultation. You know, as it is now, when one is seeking a permit, an environmental permit, NEPA may say, okay, you need to do an EIA. But how the EIA done is one thing. You know, there's nothing that will prevent the body seeking the permit from putting a 300-page document at a post office or a place where the public's supposed to have access to it. And that 300-page document is filled with a lot of legalese and technical terms that the regular man on the JUTC bus simply can't understand. The regular person, a regular farmer in Brownstone, where I'm from, simply can't understand. And we have to rely on JET and JFJ to help with the interpretation and explaining. But we only have one JFJ and we only have one JET. And so there is a need for the EIA to be mandated, but also for consultation to be legally required. And if I may just put a plug in here, that as we consider climate justice, then ratifying the ESACA agreement, which calls for the right of consultation for persons impacted, likely to be impacted, would be a positive step to strengthen the framework. And as I wind down, I'm asked to just share my thoughts about how citizens can participate more in environmental preservation and protection. And it is my own thinking that for citizens to play an active role in environmental preservation and protection, then they must be able to feel a part of the system. They must be able to feel like they are valuable stakeholders. And this includes ensuring that their interests are represented, that they're included in the discussion, that their rights are protected, particularly the rights of the most vulnerable. We're talking about our women, the poor, the children, the indigenous, the young persons. We have to ensure that their rights are protected. And that is, in fact, what a rights-based approach to the environment protection requires. Then they must also be feel to be a part of the solution. And part of the solution will also require for adequate resources to be provided, and the resources must be equitably distributed. I like to share the story about my days as a community development officer when we built a community center for a particular community, and they did not use it. And when we went back to ask them, why did you not use it? Their response is, we didn't want a community center. You came in and built a community center, you didn't ask us what we want. And so it is so important that we engage our community so that they feel a part of our process. And so the things that we do, they're a part of it. Because what we also know is that the community members, they know the solutions, they live there, they experience the climate crisis, they experience the different hardships and the effects of climate change. And so they would have solutions as to how we can treat with them. Our Maroon community is one such group that we have not engaged enough, but their cultural knowledge must not be underestimated. And we'll be amazed at how they can help us in solving some of these issues that we're treating with when it comes down to environment and environment protection. As a country, we need a national mobilization involving our children, our churches, the schools, the political parties, to start seeing the fact that climate change is an existential threat to everyone. But there's also a need for information to be available. And when we're talking about available, we're talking about accessible. Not just that it is there in a 300-page document that has a lot of legalese and technical jargons, but that it is in very simple language that the regular person can understand. I've often said that one of the challenges that we have with our advocates for the environment, and I'm so pleased with the work that JET and JFJ have been doing, is that for a long time, the conversation about climate change and the protection of the environment has been done at the university, not literally, but it has been done at that very high level where we have not taken the time to break it down in simple language so that every and any Jamaican can understand. And I'm hoping that as a country, as we see the importance of climate change and the human rights-based approach that has to be taken to climate justice, that our advocacy, that our engagement will not just be at a high level, but will be done so that everyone can understand and make their contribution. And as I close, I say that Jamaica is on the front line of climate crisis. And being on the front line of the climate crisis means that every hurricane and every tropical storm resets a great portion of our economy. And as such, we have no choice but to act now. And whereas we can't control what happens outside of Jamaica, there are things that must be dealt with locally if we're truly to give effect to what climate change, to climate justice. And perhaps I should say, learning from Mikhail, that broadened the term to say environmental justice. So we're talking about live issues that have to be addressed in the name of justice and human rights, such as mining and the thousands of Jamaicans who have been displaced, the respiratory illnesses that they have experienced, the indigenous people in our country, and the cockpit country. We're talking about deforestation and waste management. We're talking about urban forests, the building codes, beach access, and erosion. These are local issues that, as we talk about climate justice, that we are compelled to look at as the state. And we believe that integrating the human rights norms and principles in climate action and how we treat with the environment will ensure that we have a holistic approach that addresses the economic, the social, the cultural, and the political dimensions of climate change, and will empower the most affected groups and peoples, and thereby give effect to what climate justice is really about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Senator Fraser-Binns. That was a very empowering, I would say, presentation to the end there. I feel like taking some citizen action right now. But yes, thank you very much for your presentation. So I am the next presenter on the agenda, and I will be, but before I go on, I'm just gonna ask if anyone has any questions for the Senator before she goes, while she's with us. Senator, we're not quite hearing you.
Sorry, Jade. I'm saying that I'll be here for a little while longer. I'm hoping to stay for the entire program.
Okay, awesome. So I'm seeing some comments. Great presentation. 3 persons have commended your presentation, and I commend it as well. So that's 4. Any other comments, questions for the Senator? And in the time that I'm looking out for raised hands or any comments in the chat, I would just ask our communications officer to launch a poll for me that I just wanted to precede my presentation. So you should have seen something pop up, and you can just respond and then submit 3 questions, so it shouldn't take very long. All right, I hope everyone would have seen the poll and is responding. Okay. So I'm seeing a question from George Brown, if legal aid representation is available for persons who are affected. Is this a question for the Senator, Mr. Brown? Yes.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Brown. To the best of my knowledge, the civil side of legal aid is not yet activated. And so to the extent that persons would need assistance from the legal aid for environmental issue, the answer is no. But what I do know is that the Public Defender's Office, the Public Defender's Office has been given some support to persons whose rights have been impacted. And we've always recommended and suggested to them that in an area where they're unable to, whether they need legal advice, that they certainly can make contact with the Public Defender's Office.
Okay, thank you for that, Senator. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I am gonna go ahead and start my presentation. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. I hope that we're seeing it. Can just indicate in the chat, 1 or 2 persons that they are seeing. Okay, so my presentation is focused on breaking down some of the key findings that we would have found in our research. So I give a little bit of background. It's a bit of a text-heavy presentation in terms of what's on screen, but I will be breaking it down verbally as we are going along. But I leave it up on screen for those of you to read and engage a bit further with what I'm saying. So the reason that we would have commissioned this report is because we would have identified, as Mikkel would have said, that climate change and environmental practices are some of the fundamental determinants of health. They affect so many different aspects of the way that we engage with our daily lives. It affects the air, the food, water, shelter, freedom from disease. And as such, we would have been getting complaints that we would have been unsure how to proceed with, having not worked in the area prior. So we would have commissioned this report, this research, to greater understand what are the issues that are affecting those at-risk communities, what their critical needs are, what kinds of priorities we should be putting to the groups, what their vulnerabilities are, and how the level of impact that they're experiencing from the different issues that can arise from negative climate action or industrial action. So the methodology of the research was to send out about 1,000 questionnaires, which we got a good response rate of about 95%. 949 persons returned completed questionnaires. And then we also would have held some focus group sessions with persons that were affected from affected communities, and then some interviews with some high-level agencies to see what information we could glean and then conglomerate that. So before I get into the actual findings, I just want to give a little bit of light background. So we would have had bauxite mining happening in Jamaica since before our independence, which was in 1962. And the mining would have happened under what we call mining leases. So when you see SML, it means special mining license, or special mining license. And the number indicates the zone in which the license has been granted. So you would have had the SML 60 that morphed into SML 173, and those would have been granted to the Kaiser Bauxite Reynolds Company. So what we found happening was that communities are completely destroyed through this process of mining. Persons are displaced from their communities. They experience a wide range of social and economic issues, environmental issues that we're going to break down a bit further into the presentation. And it changed the family dynamics of persons with the displacement. We also saw a large amount of persons moving from their rural communities to the city and having to integrate into a new way of life and of livelihood when they do those things that have varying levels of success, right? So we looked at all of that as we went into the communities to interview persons and speak to them. So one of the things that we gleaned just generally was that there were lots of complaints about the dealings between the landowners, the farmers, and the mining companies, where mining companies would have been accused of unethical practices in these negotiations, withholding of information, or not providing the residents with the ability, with the opportunity then to seek additional consultation to see what they were agreeing to in the situations where there were agreements and so on. So there was not a lot of attention being paid to the impact that this industrial activity could be having in a more holistic sense outside of its role as a revenue driver, right? So we're also going to be speaking a bit about aggregate mining. I'm not going to get into definitions because we do have a presentation that will completely detail some more of these technicalities. But aggregate mining, we found, is mostly focused in the St. Thomas area. And it is, as we know, St. Thomas is not our most developed parish. And the mining, what we found through our research, has not allowed for further development to take place in the way that it could. So you'd find that real estate developers would have trouble with the market there because it is not a place that seems inhabitable. There is a large concentration of dust nuisance, of noise nuisance. There are issues with water availability and the quality of the water that is available due to the mining that takes place in the riverbed. So there are a great number of issues that surround the aggregate mining in St. Thomas that would have affected the community's ability to participate in economic activity, as no one would want to be in the areas where these activities are taking place. They're that overwhelming. And I would say, in our experience at Jamaicans for Justice, St. Thomas is one of the areas that we went into doing our community interventions. And just the dust alone was so overwhelming. We even said to ourselves that, of course, we were wearing masks as COVID protocol would have allowed, but we said to ourselves that we should be wearing dust masks because of how much dust there was just on the way there. It was crazy to us. So there are some other issues around illegal dumping that we would have also identified to be one of the industrial activities that is having a negative impact on our environment and climate. And part of it is because it is an area where there is some decentralization. So there are lots of agencies and different pieces of legislation covering different roles, different kinds of management, but there is no centralized body really that is overseeing all of these operations in a big picture kind of way. And so what you find is that there are lots of gaps as to how these operations are carried out. And to make things a little bit more complicated, we do have third-party actors that participate in the solid waste management area. So it might be difficult to be managing all of these different actors. And we found that that would have led to some of the issues that we saw at the Riverton dump, which has been closed for some period now. But it is our largest dump. It is the largest area of waste in Jamaica. About 60% of our waste was going to that dump site. And it covers quite a large area of land. So what we found was that the community members kind of integrated the dump into their community life. So some persons would have made money off of scavenging the dump to see what materials could be taken and resold or restored or that might be useful to them. And of course, that would lead to exposure of certain kinds of bacteria, of disease. But then more concerning is the fires. So in 2015, there was, I think, one of the most famous times when the dump was on fire. And it covered quite a large area of Kingston and St. Andrew. And it was implied that the residents are the persons that are constantly setting fire to the dump. And one thing that we found in the research that we'll go into a little further is that the residents completely dispute this. And one of the complaints that we saw was that some of the materials that are being dumped are the reasons that the dump would have been catching fire. So it doesn't have so much to do with the residents' daily activities as it does have to do with the actual waste management and the fact that the waste is not being properly separated in order for it to be safe to dispose of in those areas. And then we would have also seen from the University of the West Indies that had also produced a research looking into the effect of the environment around the Riverton city dump communities, that children would have become sick having exposure to certain water that would be accumulating around the dump after heavy rainfall. So those are some of the key facts that we would have gathered outside of our quantitative data. So I'm about to move on to our key findings, but I just wanted to talk about the poll. So we did get some responses to the poll, and I saw that most persons agreed that industrial activity can cause environmental issues. Most persons disagree that our environmental framework is strong enough, and most persons disagree that there's adequate provision and compensation for persons affected by industrial action or climate injustice. So I would have done this poll because I wanted to get an idea of where our mindset is at, because that was also part of what we did as a part of this research. So when we went into the communities, we would have tried to get a baseline of what kind of knowledge these community members have. Do they understand the term climate change, which most of them said they would have heard the term before. Whether they understood it in the fulsome way that maybe I understand it, or maybe Teresa would understand it. That wasn't really the case, but they have heard the term and they're familiar with why it exists, that it relates to the protection of the environment. About 50% of persons were concerned about climate change as an issue, about its impact, and considered it to be important. Another 21% thought it was moderately important, and another 8% didn't consider the importance of it. So when we looked at these results, we thought, okay, so we need to impact this 21 and 8% of persons who are not fully grasping how important this issue is. So that was also a driver for doing our community intervention work. So we did have 58% of respondents who would have agreed that mining should not be allowed in the cockpit country. So that was also something that would have surveyed at the time, as it is continues to be a topical issue that we had a recent development about as well, as there was an injunction issued in the constitutional case being carried against Noranda and the Environmental Planning Agency. So we also looked at the environmental nuisance and impact. So 70% of persons said they were directly impacted by environmental nuisance that come as a result of this industrial action, so whether that is mining or illegal dumping. So one of the main things that we saw that Mikkel would have alluded to when she presented was the health impact, and the airborne irritants and the air quality was one of the major things that we would have seen coming out of these communities. So for the places where there is bauxite mining, there is a lot of dust nuisance. And in St. Thomas, even though the mining is not necessarily what is causing the dust nuisance, the roadwork construction that is happening, the highway expansion that is happening, and has been happening, is a huge contributor to the dust nuisance, as well as the transport related to the mining that would have to drive over these really poor infrastructure that lifts the dust and fills the air with dust, really affecting the residents as they go about their days. We would also see, as we mentioned with Riverton, the smoke coming from the landfills, the burning of tires that would cause an environmental impact. So when we spoke to farmers in Trelawney, and not only in Trelawney, in St. Anne as well, they would have identified their displacement from their agricultural lands as one of their impacts, because quite a few of the persons would have indicated that they were not placed on land that was arable. So they could not continue their farming operation on those lands or their agricultural operations on those lands. And some persons who would have been restored to their land, so they would have been able to return to the piece of land that they would have been farming before. Not all persons are owners, so they wouldn't have sold. So they would be able to return to this land that they were farming before, and they find now, having been mined, the land is no longer arable, or having mining nearby the land is no longer arable. So they would have encountered the same issue, where they're no longer able to produce their crop from that land. So when we asked participants about where they would consider the main impact to be coming from, the main offenses to be coming from, 40% of persons would have indicated bauxite companies, and this is particularly in Manchester, St. Anne, and St. Elizabeth. And they associated the dust, as we would have said, the transportation, the hauling that's on the roads. They would have also indicated that the bauxite plants that are not in operation are not closed or properly closed. So that is also one of the things that are impacting the environment of their communities. So 40% of persons are direct to the bauxite companies. So then we looked at whether private or neighboring companies could be involved. So about 25% of persons indicated them as the main offenders for their area. So that's mostly in Kingston and St. Thomas. And that would have to do with the quarry mining, so the aggregate mining with the marl and sand. And as I would have said, it would have impacted persons' ability to live and also carry out business in these areas. And the noise nuisance is one of the huge contributors to that. In St. Thomas as well, 22% of persons would have indicated that the road work was one of the main offenses in their environmental impacts. So about 7% of persons now would have spoken about the smoke that is coming from the dump sites. And these respondents were concentrated in Kingston and St. Thomas. Another 6% would have pointed to members of their community who are disposing their garbage improperly, or burning their garbage, or doing land clearing by burning the land, coal burning. So several things like that. So it's really like community involvement in these kind of negative behaviors that will affect our climates and our environments. So about 6% of persons identified that as the main driver for environmental issues in their communities. So another thing that we looked at was access to information, the level of consultation and participation that persons felt they were able to achieve. So we found that the EIAs from Nepal, they provide guidelines that speak to community consultation, but, and this is something that we'll find that comes up a lot throughout the presentations, there is no way to ensure that these methods are used. So there is no enforceability, there is no real oversight, and I would say argue no incentive, because if it's a guideline that can be overlooked, that may very well come at an additional cost to this company, or might even be a detriment to this company, they will not want to engage with that. So I think, well, we will talk a lot about how we can fill these gaps, but I think it's clear that these need to be enforceable assessments. These need to also be enforceable consultations, where if the consultation doesn't happen, there is some redress that is available to those persons whose communities will now be affected. So of course, communities are encouraged to file complaints and organize, but this is difficult, and we can understand why. The communities are experiencing overlapping challenges where, yes, they are experiencing the negative effects of the mining. That is also affecting likely their ability to live where they are, their ability to produce income. And so to also ask of these persons to give their energy to organization, we can understand why that would be a challenge, especially with no real resources available to support these kinds of action. So that's something that we can look at in terms of garnering resources, maybe to support community groups that are fighting for their climate rights and their environmental rights. So we do have those community-based organizations like the SDC and the community development committees that are to be the main points of engagement to address these issues. But of course, I mean, the SDC does their best. Again, I'm not sure of all of the challenges. That wasn't a deep dive in the research. But I know that the SDC has partnered with us to get us into communities, to do public education, to provide legal support. So they do try their best to do some organization and to engage and to allow for participation of community members. But at this time, it is still extremely lacking, and the persons really are not given the opportunity to have a say in what happens in their communities regarding these mining licenses. So as all of that would have indicated, so there are several issues that come out of these industrial actions. So there are health issues, economic issues, social issues, environmental issues. So these were the main ones that we saw arising out of the research. So when it comes to health issues, we would have seen lots of respiratory related issues. So sinusitis, asthma, allergies, chest burning, bronchitis. And if you look at your screen right now, you should be seeing a table. And this is put straight out of the paper, where we are looking at the number of participants, the percentage points of participants that would have indicated that they've experienced varying issues and the parishes that they are from. What you'll also find is that we have a high incidence of dengue, which was a surprise to me as we finalized the research, because what you find happening is that these mines that are not closed are areas where water settles. And as we know, mosquitoes breed in areas where water settles. So we have higher incidence of mosquito-related diseases in these areas. We also have rat infestations from these unclosed pits and landfills that have not been properly restored. So residents are concerned about getting leptospirosis or any other kind of disease that could be carried by rodents or those kinds of animals. So what we would want to see, I'm sorry, somebody's mic is open. Yeah, so what we would want to see is some greater levels of research in this area. So while we appreciate the strength of our research coming directly from the residents, one of the challenges that we had with substantiating the health issues is that we are dealing with a lot of rural persons, and they have no interest whatsoever in going to the doctor. So they would be experiencing these issues, and until the issue is severe, they don't seek out any medical attention. So we don't have the data that can directly correlate the mining activity to the issues that the residents are experiencing. And what would have found in legal precedent in case law is that, for example, if the resident was going to a doctor, that doctor could speak to fact as to the issues that the resident would have been experiencing, and the doctor could speak to fact as to when these issues would have arose. But then that leaves a lot up for interpretation. So it would be a lot easier if we had some more environmental impact studies, some more investigations from the Ministry of Health in particular, to gather some stronger data on the health effects of community members when they're exposed to the remnants of mining. So the next area that we looked at was the economic effect. And I think we can all kind of have an idea of what those things would be. If there is mining taking place in your community, for example, a lot of persons are displaced, and that displacement could mean a lot of things. We find that especially in the rural areas, a lot of persons operate a small business, like a small shop or a small bar, that its success is contingent on its location. So when those persons are asked to relocate, they would have lost their ability to gain their income from that. And then, of course, a lot of the communities where mining takes place are farming communities. And so a lot of the economic gain in those communities come from the farming activities. And once the mining begins, farming activity can be severely affected. So we would have seen it be affected not only with the areability of the land, but also with the dust nuisance, where the dust covers the flora and kills the plants. So it is something that, again, affects the livelihoods of these farmers. And then we would also see, and as Teresa talks about Rio Cobre, we'll get a greater understanding of those issues as it relates to water quality. But we would also see, for example, fish kills that are as a result of waste or bauxite mining waste being dumped into the rivers. So we have to look at that kind of contamination and how it affects fishers, who their main income would come from the sale of the fish that they catch. So of course, we would have said that the farming lands are not returned or restored. So that leaves them untillable. And then the residents, it's just difficult outside of the displacement to operate business in areas where there is mining taking place. The dust nuisance alone is a huge issue. Even in our qualitative research in our focus groups, we would have had residents saying the dust is so much that they can't open their doors or windows. They're constantly sweeping. They're constantly having a damp cloth over their face inside their house. Their clothes are ruined. So it's like such a thick dust nuisance that it is detrimental to them being able to live their regular lives, much less to carry on a business, especially a business that has anything to do with the service of food or drink. So the social aspect. Now, I think we kind of cover that over, it kind of interweaves into every other issue that we would have identified. But plain and straight, these issues destroy communities, and it destroys them in varying ways. One, it causes the dislocation of persons from these communities. So it is physically destroying the community. The community has physically broken up because they've had to be displaced. The loss of economic opportunities is also a driver for displacement, but it's a driver for I can't find the right word for it right now, but it's a driver for the ruin of a community, for example. Because if there's no economic opportunities, nobody's gaining an income, then nobody can spend. So there is no money going into the maintenance of the community, which also leads to its destruction. And then, of course, we would have the health issues that arise and how those can severely affect, yes, your ability to earn, but also just your ability to live, your ability to spend time with other people, your quality of life, which would affect your ability to socialize. So when we look at these impacts, we have to consider what is there to assist those persons to recover? Which, as we would have said in our poll, we're kind of all in agreement that enough is not there. So environmentally, I think we would have gone over some of this already, but this was the main industrial nuisances. As I said, dust is number one, smoke is a close second, and then the other is kind of an aggregation of different issues, so like water contamination or other dust-related issues that were not specific to the question related to dust related issues. So that's kind of an aggregation, and then the 4% of noise and vibration nuisance. So these are some quotes from some of the residents that we would have interviewed. And the first quote that we see here related to the black spider, it is a bacteria that lives in exposed mine ground. And what was happening to these residents is that they would have their livestock that ventures into these areas of exposed mined out grounds, and the livestock becomes infected with the black spider bacteria, which causes the livestock to become ill and likely no longer being able to be butchered and used for income. So we saw that coming out in St. Anne. We also see here, and this is coming from one of the residents of Riverton, as I would have mentioned earlier, where they are contentious about the perception that they're the ones that start the fires, because what they are saying is the material that is coming into the dump is extremely flammable, and it is not being disposed of in such a way for it to be safe to not catch fire. So by the time it gets there, there are little embers, and the slightest thing will allow for it to catch fire, and then it is difficult to get control of. And the final quote that we have here speaks, again, this one came from St. Anne, where the resident was talking about just the effect of the dust in their home, their plants, their clothes, and they spoke about the bauxite mining companies providing compensation. So one of the things that came out in our research was a lot of informal offers were being made to residents from the bauxite company to alleviate dust nuisance or dust related issues. This would normally be a sum that the resident has no say in its negotiation. It's just a sum that is provided to them. And they are not given any formal indication of what this is really for. Some of the times they don't get the money. Some of the times they get the money on an irregular schedule. Sometimes it's on a regular schedule. Sometimes they get more, sometimes they get less. So it's a very informal, very strange system in which the bauxite company is claiming that they are compensating residents for the dust nuisance and providing maybe, I think from the report we got maybe $8,000 per month. I saw another that was getting $6,000 a fortnight. So they're very irregular in the time frame and the amounts. Yeah. So one of the things that we looked at was attitudes towards industrial activity in these affected communities. So I had mentioned it earlier, but we spoke about whether the cockpit country should be mined, and we found that the majority was in agreement that it should not be mined. We also asked whether environmental nuisance compensation policies should be formalized. We found that we got a high incidence of answers, but not many persons were in agreement that it should be formalized. What many persons were in agreement with was that persons should be legally compensated if the industry cannot control the nuisances, that precautions should be taken by the government to ensure that there's a reduction in environmental nuisances, and that the precautions taken should reduce the nuisances. So the residents themselves are asking for additional protections, formal protections for their environments. So then we did get some specific community-based recommendations. So the community members, organizations, this is kind of a conglomeration of those findings. And they would have stated, firstly, that they are interested in legal assistance. They want to be able to have legal representation, even if it is just in the negotiation phase with these mining companies, to see about their compensation, to see about their relocation, but also for those persons who would have already experienced what they would consider to be a breach of their right to a healthy environment, or other breaches, to get some legal assistance for those persons. And one of the challenges that they would have had with that is the expense, having lost your income or having experienced health issues due to industrial action, and then also having to find the funds to bring an action against the company responsible. It can be a lot to be asking of our residents. So there is a desire for legal services. So coming out of this research, JFJ would have been there providing legal support, giving legal advice, taking complaints, assisting persons to seek redress. So then we would have our advocacy and community education. So this session is a part of those efforts as well. But the residents themselves would have indicated that one of the issues that they're having is, and I say colloquially, but them say people don't know them rights, right? So we want to go out and introduce the persons, what is this environmental framework that we're under, what the gaps are, how can they be directly affected depending on their community. So that is some of the work that we have been doing in that area, and that we'll continue to do. Just even this week, we will be doing one of those sessions with some community members affected in St. Anne. And then the final thing that residents were talking about was the strengthening of oversight agencies. So this is to refer to NEPA and other agencies that are responsible for ensuring the proper operation of mining companies and ensuring the proper disposal of solid waste. And they found, in their own estimation as residents, that the oversight was not strong enough. They felt as though the agencies themselves were not strong enough. For example, NEPA not being able to enforce community consultations or to enforce the findings that they would have found in their environmental impact assessments was cited as one of the issues with the environmental protection framework. So we're at the end now of my presentation. And this section I have added because unfortunately, Mr. Rainford will not be able to join us. And I'm just gonna briefly state, I know a lot of persons on the session are persons who are either in the legal profession or about to be in the legal profession, or you are persons who have an interest in advocacy and climate justice. And so we at JFJ are open to working with you. At the end of the session, Vanessa, who will be closing out, will give her contact information, her email address. And for those persons who are interested in working directly with us, whether that be as an intern or you have your own practice and you want to bring a claim that you'd like our assistance in bringing, whatever it is, you can reach out to Vanessa, who will, like I said, she will share her information at the end of the session, and we will make contact with you and discuss that. So right now, we are in the midst of, as we're preparing some claims, as Michael would have said, they're legal matters, so we can't really speak as to what exactly is happening. But what we can say is that we are currently in preparation of several claims, some of them in relation to the most recent spill that would have taken place in the Rio Cobre, and some persons that would have been affected economically by that spill. We would also be willing to take individual claims, so we would also be providing support in that way. So normally when we take the constitutional claims, we consolidate several clients, as we found that that is a stronger way to bring the case forward. But we would also take individual claims, especially where the claims are extremely strong, and where the client has a good amount of evidence to show the effect that they would have had from varying industrial action. And then we talk about land titling. So we do that as a part of our presentations. Well, as a part of our assistance, because we found that one of the issues that affect persons who are in these areas is they do not have a formal claim to the land that they own, which will affect the way how they're able to negotiate with these companies. So we assist with that as well. And we also assist with our public education and public advocacy. Yes, so as I said, if you're interested in working with JFJ, I'm gonna ask that you reach out to Vanessa. I'm actually gonna ask Vanessa to share her information now, and then she can share it again at the end in the chat. And if you're interested, just please reach out to her and let us know of that interest. And that is the end of my presentation. So I am taking questions if anyone has any questions on what would have been said.
Okay, so we had 2 questions previously, well, 3, 2 for you and 1 for the senator. Tina, she was asking the name of the research. Mia was asking how can we access the research paper? And there was 1 question for the senator. Stafford Grant, he was asking what plans are there for an industrial recycling company in Jamaica?
Oh, okay. So I'll allow the senator to answer first. Can you just repeat the question for her, please?
Okay, so Stafford Grant, he was asking what plans are there for an industrial recycling company in Jamaica?
Thank you, Stafford, for that. Thank you, Stafford, for that question. However, I am not sure what, if any, plans there are for that. I know that there was a conversation regarding the recycling of tires, and that has not been concluded as yet, but certainly on a wider scale, I can't speak with any certainty as to what, if any, plans there are.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Senator. I hope that answered Mr. Grant's question. Yes, so I had a question. How can we access the research paper? Okay, so the research paper, it is not publicly available quite yet, but it will be in short order. We just needed to go over some final cleaning up of it. The data is sound, but we just needed to do some finalization in terms of the appearance of the paper, and then it will be ready for release. So what I will do, we did do a registration for this session. So for those persons who are present, I would be happy to share the paper with you. But also once the paper is finalized and ready for public dissemination, it would be shared on all of JFJ's platforms or social media, on our website. So it will be available for public access soon. So you can watch our social media pages. And once it is available, an announcement would be made on those pages. I'm seeing another question.
Before you answer that question, Jade,
yes.
Tina was asking the name of the research paper.
Oh, okay. So the name of the research paper is, it's quite long, so that's why I'm pausing. Yes, it is Situational Analysis of Access to Information, Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters in Jamaica. Yes, so quite a long name. I will put it in the chat so that you can see it. And then the final question I saw was, do you think monitoring in order to cost the health effects of industrial activity is low-hanging fruit? No, I don't think it's low-hanging fruit, because I think that the data that we have now is insufficient. I think that there needs to be a strengthening of that data. So I think that's just foundationally, we need some more. So I don't think it's low-hanging fruit, no. Okay, I'm looking if there are any raised hands, any other questions. If not, I am gonna ask Nastasia Robinson, who is friend and family to JFJ, to go ahead and start. And just a reminder, she's joining us to discuss the legislative framework around all of these issues I would have just discussed with you. So thanks, Nastasia.
Thank you so much, Jay, for having me. Thanks. Anything for JFJ. Okay, so today I am going to just take you quickly through.
The Executive Director smiled when you said that, Ms. Robinson.
Pardon?
The Executive Director smiled when you said that. I had
to. Executive Director. Today I will be taking you through some of the laws. It's quite a bit, as Jade had mentioned. There isn't anything comprehensive. So our legislation for environmental law is scattered all over the place. But I'll try my best to see how quickly we can go through some of the more important ones. All right, so our presentation is going to be focused on three primary objectives. The first one being to appreciate, or to come to appreciate and understand environmental rights as a human right, right? A healthy environment as a human right. We're going to then quickly look at the legislative present framework for environmental protection in Jamaica, with special attention to mining and solid waste management. And then finally, I'm just going to quickly breeze over some of the redress options that are available when environmental rights are disregarded. So some of you may or may not know, but the environmental protection is enshrined as a constitutional right in our Constitution under Article 13.3 of our Bill of Rights. And it says that we have the right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment free from the threat of injury or damage from environmental abuse, degradation, or ecological heritage. Although there is constitutional protection for this right, there is no comprehensive body of laws, and the laws are kind of just all over the place, which makes enforcement a lot harder because you have entities going, well, it's not mine, it's not mine. I'm sorry, someone just said full screen and I did not realize that I was not doing full screen before. My apologies. Okay, so we're going to quickly look at some of our laws. So we're guided by Jamaica's climate change policy, which was developed in 2015 and was updated in 2021. And the idea behind the climate change policy is to guide the sustainable development aspect of the 2030 agenda, Vision 2030. The primary goal of this policy is to reduce the economic and development fallouts from climate change. And this includes the rising temperatures, the extreme rainfall events. When it rains a lot, we have a lot of landslide and flooding. The increase in mosquito borne diseases, we are aiming to decrease those, and waterborne diseases as well, which are more common than you'd expect in Jamaica. There are three main goals of the policy. The first is to strengthen Jamaica's adaptive capacity and resilience to reduce its vulnerability to climate change. That is to put things in place that protects us from the effects of climate change. As many of you will know, we are fast approaching climate departure. And so one of the policy's goals is to make sure we're doing the things that we can to reduce the impacts of climate change. Secondly, it aims to pursue a low carbon development and enhance access and mobilization of climate finance in order to do this work. The policy is also concerned with public education around climate change in general, and climate action in terms of what can the country and citizens alike do to combat climate change. Jamaica is party to a host of international treaties that form part of our obligations as it relates to environmental protection. As far as being in compliance with most of these, it's questionable and debatable, but we are party to a lot. The most notable of them being Rio Declaration on Environmental Development, which was done in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1992. And out of that, what is important about it came the right for access to information and public participation, which are two very critical tools in environmental human rights advocacy. So when we talk about our national environmental laws, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. I was told I have 30 minutes and I'm just trying to stick to that, but I also don't want to rush the presentation. Okay, so in addition to our international obligations, we do have some local laws, many of them, and some of them are listed on your screen. The most notable ones for our discussions today are the NRCA, the Natural Resources Conservation Authority Act, the Mining Act, the Quarries Control Act. We also have the Wildlife Protection Act. We also have the Public Health Garbage Protection Act. It's not listed here, but it's there as well. Because each parish is responsible for their own garbage disposal. So each parish has a garbage collection and disposal regulation, right? So let's talk about the NRCA. The NRCA, the Natural Resources Conservation Authority Act, is perhaps the most important piece of legislation in environmental law. It establishes the NRCA, which is the National Resources Conservation Authority, and that body is essentially NEPA. Their work is carried out by NEPA. We'll talk about NEPA a little bit in a minute, but essentially the act establishes the authority, and it also sets out legislation for the promotion of public awareness of environmental issues and concerns in Jamaica. And it also manages our national parks or marines, and essentially all of our natural resources are managed by the Natural Resources Conservation Authority. And the Act provides legislation for how the authority goes about that sort of protection. Some of the key things is that the authority has power to designate national parks and protected areas, such as the cockpit country that was declared a protected area a few years ago. The Act also sets out the importance of environmental impact assessments and tells the instances in which those might be required. In fact, it's while it's not mandatory that an EIA is done, an environmental impact assessment, NEPA through the NRCA can make requests for it, and they really should be making requests for every new project that is being undertaken. Finally, the Act grants licenses or can restrict persons from discharging trade effluents or any sort of other polluting matter. So as I said, NEPA is the leading organization, and NEPA is essentially the head of two government entities, the National Resources Conservation Authority and the Town and Country Planning Act. The NEPA carries out the functions for both of these entities, both of these acts, right? Or both of these entities. And when we talk about environmental and who's responsible, the answer is largely NEPA. NEPA is the overarching main body when it comes to environmental protection in Jamaica. So although there are many other entities such as the Mines and Geology Division, or the different bauxite mining companies, or for example, the parish councils, NEPA is our all-encompassing environmental protection agency. And the core functions, some of the core functions of NEPA, they're in charge or they're responsible for policy and program development. They are responsible, very importantly, for the conservation and protection of Jamaica's natural resources. They're also responsible for spatial planning. So when you see developments taking place, no development can take place unless NEPA authorizes them. They manage all environmental applications. Every project that involves some environmental impact must be passed through NEPA. They're responsible for public education and outreach as well, which means it's their responsibility to educate Jamaicans on the importance of environmental protection and how we go about doing so. And finally, very importantly, they are responsible for monitoring environmental projects and enforcing the NRC and other, primarily the NRCA, but to oversee other acts that speak to environmental protection. So very quickly, we're going to look at mining in Jamaica and some of the laws that govern mining. So we know most of us are very familiar with mining. If you travel outside of Kingston and St. Andrew, you're likely to have passed many, especially if you're traveling before the highway was done, traveling through Little Instead and so on, you would have been passing some bauxite companies along that way. So we're in some way familiar with mining, but mining is essentially extraction of valuable minerals from the earth, right? And this can be from the earth's surface or below the earth. In Jamaica, the primary minerals that we mine are bauxite, very one of our main things that we mine, but we also mine sand and gravel and other elements or other minerals from the earth. And that sort of mining is known as aggregate mining, right? So importantly, we must note that environmental rights include the right to health, a fair hearing, access to information, and the right to a healthy environment, which mining can impact. Okay, so very briefly, in Jamaica, mining is granted, you get a mining license from the Mines and Geology Division. Even though you get this license from the Mining and Geology Division, you still need authorization from NEPA as well. Your mining leases last up to 25 years before they can be renewed. And the minerals that we mine, as I said before, include bauxite, coal, sand, rocks, etc. Again, we're not going to spend too much time on bauxite because Teresa is coming to deliver a very lovely and detailed, I'm sure, presentation about bauxite mining in Jamaica. But it is one of the primary minerals that we mine. As I said before, aggregate mining involves rock, sand, gravel, and other similar aggregate materials. The limestones, as someone mentioned in the chat, all of those things, any mineral that can be extracted from the earth can be mined, but you have to have special licenses granted to you by the Mines and Geology Division in order to mine any mineral from the land, right? So some of the main offenses under the Mining Act is that it's against the law to interfere with any prospecting or mining operations authorized under the Mining Act. It's also important to note that it is an offense to obstruct any person in carrying out a prospecting or mining license or mining right. It is an offense to interfere with any mining machinery, plant, works, or property, or to break, deface, or remove any boundary, mark, or signpost. The fines for this are pretty low because the act is still a bit outdated. The fine is $200 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. Now, in terms of the environmental impacts of mining, Jay would have gone through a lot of, what the impacts are, and what are the main concerns in mining communities. Is in addition to the health concern, one of the major things is what happens to the land, because a lot of these lands that are mined are areas that are known for farming. And so what happens to these lands or where people live? What happens when the mining is done? And under the Mining Act, each mining company has a duty to rehabilitate the land that they mine. So they remove the topsoil, they remove or extract the minerals or whatever it is that they're mining, coal, whatever it may be, and they're supposed to restore that land for agricultural purposes, right? So it can grow back, so it can flourish. But we know in reality that doesn't always happen. And because there's no, the language is so loose in the legislation as to what restoration is, it's a very questionable practice. And farmers will tell you no amount of rehabilitation can actually bring the land back to being fruitful. So what happens if the mining company does not restore the land though? Ordinarily, once mining is complete, the mining company has a responsibility to rehabilitate the land. However, if they don't do this within a reasonable time, they can be fined up to 25,000 USD per hectare of land that they mine. Failure to restore within 3 years attracts an additional $25,000, right? But unfortunately, this is what we see is that the government can exempt some mining companies from restoring the land, and a lot of companies actually take up that exemption. So restoration isn't done as often or to the extent or to the standard that is necessary to properly rehabilitate the land, right? So when we look at in terms of legalities, it's not that the landowners are just to sit by, and we'll talk about a case shortly, and do nothing when they realize that their rights are being infringed on. One of the key things that happens in mining, especially in bauxite communities, is where mining companies get their licenses, and part of the land that is licensed is actually owned or being occupied by persons. They don't simply have the right to go in and take out that land from under that person. They must first give notice to the owner or occupier of that land. And note here that occupier includes persons with any legal right to be on the land. So you don't necessarily need to own the land to effect this right. You just need to be occupying it. So you need 14 notice before any kind of mining activity takes place. And once you've been given notice, you have the right to demand compensation, read what you think is reasonable based on the value of the land. And if you're not satisfied with what is proposed to you, legal action in the courts to get proper compensation is always an option. Note though that this is expensive, and as Jade would have let you know, that is one of the major reasons why persons end up basically what we say give away their rights, because the process and the cost of legal action can be so much. So we look now at mining in the cockpit country. So the cockpit country is a very important body of resources, I will say, or land that possesses so much resources for Jamaica. It's one of our largest natural water bodies. Still exists. There was 40% of our water resources existing in the cockpit country. And so it's very important, and we have noted, environmentalists have noted the importance of protecting the cockpit country. So much so that out of a campaign that was led by JET some years ago, in 2017, the Prime Minister finally declared cockpit country to be a protected area. However, he didn't delineate the boundaries for what areas fall in and out of the cockpit country. And so what we see is that a few years later, mining licenses, specifically special mining license SML 173, was granted with some areas of the cockpit country within its boundaries. And so because of that, there were a couple of residents who took issue with this and brought the matter to court. This matter is still live before the courts. However, there's a small success story here, as recently the court granted an injunction preventing any further mining until the matter is substantially deliberated by the courts. Some of the things that the parties in this matter are contending is that the granting of SML, which is Special Mining License 173, breaches their constitutional right to life, their right to receive information, their right to reside in any part of Jamaica, their right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment, and their right to protection from degrading treatment. These elements are still to be decided on the court, but what the court has said is that it's seen enough to decide right now that it is important to prevent any mining from happening until the matter is properly decided by the court. We turn our attention now to solid waste management in Jamaica, and solid waste is essentially managed by four main entities in Jamaica. There's the National Solid Waste Management Authority. There's the ODPM, the Office of Disaster Preparedness, the Ministry of Health, which houses our public health bodies, and our Pesticide Control Authority. Again, we have a number of legislations in place that deal with waste management and just waste in general. The main ones being the National Solid Waste Management Act, the Public Nuisance Regulations, the Public Health Garbage Collection and Disposal Regulation, and the Wildlife Protection Act. Those are the main ones. All of them are important because they do, they separate the issues in so many different legislations that depending on the issue, you may want to revert to different legislations. But the NSW Act, which was established or enforced in 2001, established the National Solid Waste Authority, which is responsible for waste management across Jamaica. They grant licenses for solid waste management, and they are the ones responsible for largely for garbage collection or solid waste management across Jamaica. Importantly, the Riverton landfill was established by the solid waste, which was established many years ago, is now regulated by the National Solid Waste Authority, and is responsible or accepts over 60% of residential and industrial waste from the country. Some main offenses under the Act are littering. As you can see, the fines are very minimal and not very discouraging in terms of enforcement. The highest one being employing persons to deface property or public spaces, that being a fine of $10,000. We then look at the Public Health Garbage Collection and Disposal Regulation. As I said before, each parish council is responsible for garbage collection in that parish. And that specifically relates to residential garbage or garbage collection, residential collection and disposal. Please note that under this act, or this regulation rather, commercial entities must organize and dispose of and make their own arrangements for disposal of their trade, right? So you shouldn't have a commercial entity or a garbage truck that come to pick up residential garbage, picking up commercial garbage as well. That is in prohibition of the regulation, right? The fines in the regulation are up to $50,000 or 12 months in prison. And in addition to the fine, the authority can also cause people to remove any garbage, the person in breach of the offense, to remove any garbage which is improperly disposed, to reimburse the local authority, to compensate any person who has suffered loss or damages due to the improper disposal, and to properly dispose of garbage, or they can also get the person to properly dispose of garbage that was improperly removed from a disposal site. Garbage collection is a huge issue in Jamaica, as we know, and the concern is even more as the government is entering into talks to privatize the sector. We then have our Wildlife Protection Act, which is the act that prohibits any discharge of effluent into our rivers or any water body that contains fish. So this is specifically when we think about the Windalco situation or other companies that may discharge waste into our water bodies, such as Rehoboth they're specifically in contravention of the Wildlife Protection Act. And the penalty under this act is up to $100,000 fine or imprisonment up to 2 years. Redress options. Because the legislation is so disjointed, it makes accessing redress particularly challenging. And so because even in the wake of entities such as NEPA and NSWMA, there aren't many, and even though they have, you know, enforcement, or they should have enforcement arms, we find that these enforcements are weak. And so your best bet in protecting your environmental rights is unfortunately through advocacy and legal action at the moment. But in addition to those very, you know, stricter, more stringent strategies, other ways that you can engage in advocacy is to, you know, remain informed in terms of what's happening in your community. Remember that you have a right to access the information. And, you know, there's a host of information available at Jamaicans for Justice and other entities about your right to access to information and your right to public participation, and those two rights are two critical, as I said, advocacy tools in environmental protection. You know, one of the things that you want to do as well is you want to obtain licenses or leases or any other environmental permits that are granted to see the kind of conditions or implications they may have on the environment around you. You can also request meetings with the relative entities that are in charge of these projects, whether it be the mining companies or your local government authorities, or even NEPA, because they do take meetings with interest groups as well who have concerns. But as I said, again, legal action and community advocacy and education are very important tools in the redress process in terms of advocating for and addressing environmental protection. Right. Do we have any questions? That brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope it was short and comprehensive enough for us to grasp the concepts, or I hope it wasn't too thinly done, so it was of some value to you. Any questions?
While I'm looking out I'm looking out, but I'm not seeing any questions at this time. And what I will say, if anyone thinks of anything that they would like to ask in relation to anything that has been presented today, you can feel free to reach out to Vanessa, whose email was sent in the chat, and just send those questions, and we will be doing our best to respond to those questions. So thank you very much, Nastasia, for your presentation. I was informed, I've heard some version of this information before, but it's always good to refresh yourself, and I appreciate you being here today and educating everyone on our legislative framework. So with Nastasia ending now, we are saving a little time. We're about 30 minutes behind, because I would have expected Teresa to have presented already, but we're here now and we're ready for Teresa. So she is the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Jamaica Environment Trust. I don't know if she'll share anything about JET, just briefly for you guys, so that you can get an idea of just their general work. And then she will go into her presentation. So Teresa.
Thank you, Jade. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes, we're all seeing.
Okay, good. All right, thank you so much for having me in this workshop today. And Nastasia, thank you very much for that very comprehensive presentation. There are some things that I'll probably be touching on, but it's just reinforcement for those of us who are here, and that's good. JET has been, or JET is Jamaican Environment Trust. We are an environmental NGO. We've been in operation since 1991, and our mission is to protect Jamaica's natural resources. And for several decades, we have been focused on the extractive industry, in particular, bauxite mining, but also the general industry as a whole. And we've produced several bodies of work that has focused on the regulatory framework and have looked at some weaknesses made some recommendations. But we've also most recently done a study on the bauxite industry, and it's the bauxite and alumina industry, and it's the only comprehensive piece of work that exists in Jamaica called Red Dirt, for short, a multidisciplinary study of the industry. So today, I'm going to focus on the Rio Cobre case study, but I am a geographer, and so I do like to give some context. So let's jump straight into it. If the screen would only move. Not quite sure what's going on here. Okay. At the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that you will all leave with a better understanding. Although Nastasia has done an excellent job, I will probably touch on a few things. The importance of an effective and environmental regulatory framework that's specific to the industry with recommendations for improvement. You're going to learn a bit more about the Rio Cobre situation that took place recently and the actions that have taken place over the years, especially in relation to the regulatory bodies, leading us to the incident, the most recent incident that took place in July. So as I mentioned, I like context. So I'm going to give you a bit of background. I won't dwell on it because you've heard from multiple speakers already on some of these issues. But I also wanted to start off by just reiterating that the impacts of bauxite mining and the impacts of alumina, the processing of alumina or extracting alumina from bauxite using the Bayer process, has different impacts. And I've just highlighted a few of these for you. So bauxite mining, really, the impacts are vast, but they tend to focus on, we'll look at things like deforestation and ecological degradation impacting the flora and the fauna, the impacts of dust on both our air as well as the water quality, the reduced soil quality, forced relocation, loss of livelihoods, and there's a whole host of other social impacts, but we just kind of lump it into these issues. And then we have, when we look at more specifically at the refinery process of the process of extracting alumina from bauxite, we look at things, the pollution of air, we look at dust, we look at high carbon emissions. We also have water pollution, ecological degradation, as well as impacts on livelihoods. And Nastasia really gave us a very comprehensive look at the regulatory framework, and I've just kind of put it up back here on the screen, and I'm not going to go through these. These are just some of the main environmental regulatory framework laws and regulations that relate to the environment as well as mining and quarrying. And you can see things like the Mining Act, the Mining Regulations, NRC Act 1991, and so forth. And again, touching on it because of course repetition helps us to remember these things sometimes. Jamaicans, as we have heard already, we all have a constitutional right to enjoy a healthy and productive environment, and which is free from the threat of injury or damage from environmental abuse and degradation of ecological heritage. And some people, and this is something that we've recognized in our consultations with community, this doesn't mean much. Saying that we have a constitutional right doesn't really, it's not that it doesn't mean much, it doesn't resound, it doesn't have that impact to several people that are actually being impacted by the industry and impacted by other projects as well, not just bauxite mining. So, but a healthy environment, what is that? What does that mean? And oftentimes we've had to break it down, and a healthy environment, this refers to clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a safe climate, which that's hard to even grasp, but healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, non-toxic environment in which to live, work, study, and play. Okay, and I wanted to say this, why do we need environmental laws and regulations? Now, a healthy environment is critical to public health and strong, sustainable economies. And environmental legislation and regulations are central in protecting people, as well as your plants, your animals, your land, your air, your water, basically in the greater ecosystem that we exist in. Now, environmental law ensures that individuals, governments, and companies do not cause harm to the environment or its ecosystem. But is this enough? Is it enough to just say we have the laws and we have the regulations? And this is why I wanted to look at, we've heard this discussion on a couple of occasions in relation to the enforcement of laws. So for environmental legislation to work, it must not only be well designed, but it must also be efficiently and effectively enforced. And monitoring and enforcement of Jamaica's environmental laws, policies, and regulations is weak at both national and local levels. And that's not just saying this. This is something that multiple reports and studies have shown over the years. Case in point is this case study that I'm going to share with you about inadequate monitoring of Windalco, resulting in several pollution incidents over the years. But also I wanted to highlight that not to say that we have adequate environmental laws. As you've heard, our environmental framework is really scattered all over the place, which actually makes it very difficult to monitor. But a recent study, which was done by Capri in 2018, said that if Jamaica were to actually implement the policies that already exist and to enforce the laws that already exist, environmental protection would be far more effective than it is at present. So before we add any new laws, and there are recommendations, we have an NRCA Act, but it is not holistic, it's not comprehensive. We don't have a NEPA Act, which is one of those recommendations that have been made many years ago. So before we even think about adding new laws, if we were actually to implement and enforce the existing laws and regulations that we have, effective environmental protection would be that much more effective. And I put up this graphic. I've borrowed it from Freedom Imaginaries, and it just highlights some of the things that we've said. When we have that poor regulatory framework, or weak environmental regulatory framework in the industry, things like weak oversight, inaccessible remedies, which we've heard about, no access to participation, no access to information, combine that with the impacts of the industry, what you do is you end up with significant violations of human rights, such as your illnesses, your loss of livelihoods, destruction of ecological and cultural heritage, and so forth. And so I liked how they had Freedom Imaginaries had framed this, and I just wanted to put this back up here because it kind of pulls together a lot of what we're going to be talking about. All right, so now let's look at a case study. I think it was of recovery. I think it was important to put some of those things to frame it in this way. Here's a map of the Rio Cobre. It's a very complex system. Not everybody's familiar with reading maps, but this nice bright blue line in the middle of this map is what we know as Rio Cobre, but it is fed by multiple smaller tributaries, things like Black River, not the one in St. Elizabeth. We have Binlos Gully, we have Rio Pedro, Rio Doro, but it actually starts as a small stream known as Murmuring Brook, and you can see it from the red star that's over to the left of the image. And as I said, it has multiple tributaries which enter and eventually become this massive and major, very significant river. And I'm going to tell you more about why it is significant. Now, it supplies between 30 and 40% of the fresh water for Spanish Town and St. Catherine. So not only does it provide potable water, that's drinking water, It also supplies water for farmers. It supplies directly to the National Irrigation Commission for farmers in St. Catherine and all of those agri parks, because there's a canal system. It also supplies fish for many fishers. And at least what we have learned is it's at least over 120 fishers, but we know that there are more. It's also used for recreational purposes, as we can see from this image right here. And several industries, unfortunately, they discharge into the river for, whether it be manufacturing or agriculture. And then let's look at Windalco. And I'll show you another map which kind of puts all of these things into relation with each other. Windalco, this here is a mud stacking plant, or what they call the Charlemont stacking pond, mud stacking pond or Charlemont stacking pond. Windalco is one of 4 refineries in Jamaica, and it was originally built by Alcan in 1959. It's now owned by UC Roussel, and this is separate and apart from the actual plant, where they go through the process, the Bayer process. They use sodium hydroxide. They extract sodium hydroxide at very concentrated, at high concentrations, and they use it to extract the alumina from the bauxite. And then this sludge is then emptied onto this mud stacking pond. And if you can see very closely, so let's look at the top left of the image. That's where you would say it first enters, and then they spread it out, and it's the water or the slurry, or the liquid slurry, it then drains through a series of drain pathways that enter into this darker area at the bottom right hand corner of your image, called the effluent holding pond. The idea, if you read the documents, is that this effluent, because it is a high concentration of sodium hydroxide, which is needed in the Bayer process, is then taken and pumped back to the plant where it is reused. And so what they have said is that they do not need a permit to discharge this. They don't need to treat it because it's a closed loop system, right? But what has happened is that it's heavy rainfall in the area. It has been under designed, and heavy rainfall in the area adds volume to this pond, which causes it to overflow at times. And so the EHP, or the effluent holding pond, has a capacity of, this is the original one, has a capacity of 810,000 cubic meters. Now it's lined with clay. It's not lined with any other material. It's only lined with clay, and it is designed to capture that effluent, as I mentioned, for recycling. Initially, many of you know Mount Russell, right? And you know the mud lake. And so what happened prior to the construction of this effluent holding pond in 1985 was that the waste was simply deposited in this area, which is unlined. But it's a partially lined limestone depression, not with any geotextiles or anything, just clay. So it's partially lined. But the problem was that it started to leak, and the high levels of sodium were being found in groundwater. And so this area was used until about 1991 when it was decommissioned. In fact, they are still trying to treat this mud lake. It's still there. It's still not closed, right? Here's the image that I referred to. You have the Yuaton Works here, right smack in the center with these black dots. That's where the plant is. So initially, if you see the right hand, the top left, that's where Mount Russell, the ponds, they used to transport that waste back up there. Now it is just transported to this mud lake, which you can see. And what this map shows you is that you see all the water courses, the tributaries. You see, in fact, how they're so close to this effluent pond. Actually, one actually goes through it according to this map, which is a Binloss Gully. And actually, that's where the first discharge often takes place. All right. Now, While there are several other industries that are located along the river and which also discharge into the Rio Cobre, no other toxic discharges, no other discharges of this level of toxicity have occurred. Windalco has several permits, several environmental permits and licenses, but none are to discharge effluent into the Rio Cobre. But there is an MOU, which we understand. I've not seen it, but we have heard it mentioned too on multiple occasions. And it allows Windalco to discharge effluent during periods of heavy rainfall with the hope of the dilution effect. So whenever there is heavy rainfall, they are allowed to release this highly alkaline liquid, which with the hope that it will be adequately diluted from the additional water caused by heavy rainfall so that it won't have the significant environmental impact as it would have if there's no rainfall. Now, remember when I said this was built, it was first built in 1985. Now, residents first started complaining of spills from the mud stacking pond and how it and its impact on the Rio Cobre soon after its construction. And this is from the late 1980s. So we spoke to a couple of old timers and we heard that this has been a problem since then. So soon after it was constructed. And over the years, we've seen multiple discharges that have resulted in fish kills. I've highlighted some of the most recent ones we have in 2011, 2019, 2020, 2021, and most recently in 2022. Here are just some images that we've pulled that just shows these are the different reports on the fish kills that have taken place over the years. Okay, what has been NEPA's response? Nastasio indicated to you that NEPA plays this significant role. So not only do they grant environmental permits, but they're supposed to monitor and enforce those permits. And in their responses, we're supposed to see that we don't have, or ideally, you don't want to see repeat offenses. And if you have repeat offenses, you want to see harsher action taken so that we don't have these offenses. But what we have seen here is that between 2011 and October 2019, Windalco has been served at least 6 enforcement notices. And I'll tell you that information to get this information has not been easy. We've had to file, we have had to submit several access to information requests, and months later, sometimes we've had to submit appeals to try and get the information. It's not been forthcoming. But anything that impacts our environment, anything that impacts public health should actually be publicly known. So this is one of our recommendations for many years, that we shouldn't have to be like in other jurisdictions. This information is on the websites. This is not something that we should have to go in and simply request. The permits, you can't even get an access. You can't even readily access. You have to submit an access to information request. Again, between 2020, more recently, 2020 and 2022, we noticed that, or we found that they were served 10 breach or enforcement notices. 3 of those have been related to the discharge of untreated effluent. And each time the action, if you look at the notes, the action is to cease the discharge of effluent or the permit will be suspended. Windalco is now currently the defendant in a legal case filed by NEPA over the 2019 discharge into the river. And the 2020 incident is now in court. And coming out of these actions, what we now know, or what has now been required by NEPA, is a posting of environmental performance bonds. How it is calculated, we are not clear. We've requested this information, but what we do know is that the environmental performance bonds do not consider social impacts. So the environmental impacts or the performance bonds are to be distributed to NEPA for them to use to rehabilitate once there is some kind of negative impact on the environment as a result of, say, a discharge. And we saw the impacts of this because they now had to use these bonds to pay for the social impacts, the loss of livelihood for fishers, and and for other agencies that were negatively impacted and they could not supply and earn their income. One of the other things that NEPA had requested is that in 2018 and 2019, they said, okay, because you're having so many spills, you need to increase the size of your holding pond. And in January 2022, this was launched. The capacity was now to be 660,000 cubic meters, and to add to that previous 810 cubic meters. And it was supposed to be completed by the end of 2022. Early January, I had heard that because of some rains, they weren't able to complete it. I don't know the status of it. We haven't been informed. But this is what it looks like overhead. So we have holding pond number 1, as you can see, and holding pond number 2 right to the side. I really want to point out that the Charlemont High School is right next to the holding pond, but of course, you know, the permit says not to construct within 100 meters. We're supposed to have a tree buffer, not to construct. I think it's within 100 meters of a closest structure. And so just on rough calculations, it appears that this has been respected, but of course, the school is right there. No EIA was done for this expansion of the pond. No public notice was given that the pond was going to be there. And the whole public consultation process did not exist and should have existed, even if an EIA was not required. And getting access to the studies that were done to inform the design has also been challenging. Whether or not these designs also consider climate change and the increased rainfall that is likely to come in one event, for example, which we see that we have a lot more intense periods of rainfall, we do not know. Okay, I've alluded to some of the impacts of the most recent event. We looked at ecological impacts of the Tilleria cobra, fish scales, and other organisms, loss of livelihoods, and to frame it so that you can understand, the fishers typically earn up to about 60,000 Jamaican dollars per month, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on how well they do and how often they go to the river. And after 6 months, the fish have not returned to commercial viability. So yes, they're able to, some have said they're able to do some fishing, but mostly for dinner. Some people said I can't even catch for dinner. And remember, so this is for many, this is their primary source of protein. So not only is it their primary source of income, it's their primary source of protein for their families. We also saw that the impacts of this most recent event is on water quality. So NWC, NIC, and other users of the river for water, irrigation, and potable water, they were not able to use it. Now, it's not as long term as the ecological impacts, because after, it's not a standing body of water, it is a moving body of water. So the water quality returns after a period of time. And the scale of the impact, just to quantify, has been estimated at exceeding $200 million. And just to remind you, the value of the performance bond is $115 million approximately. So who takes up this excess? What was the government action taken by this most recent event? We saw that NEPA in August, soon after the event took place, they outlined their intended actions. They said they were going to serve a notice of intention to suspend the permits, to draw down on the full amount of the performance bond, and to pursue prosecution against the company for the pollution incidents and its breach of both the Wildlife Protection Act and the NRCA Act. And then again, in November 9, so after that statement was made, there was a lot of silence. There was silence, rather, there was silence, and this was concerning because we have a tendency for things, for major things to happen, and then we don't hear about them anymore. And so, it was part of, we felt it was very important, not just JET, but JET and other organizations, JFJ, Friends of Rio Cobra, Freedom Imaginaries, we all felt it was important to continue this dialogue publicly. And so we made several calls in a public space to find out what's happening. Tell us what's happening. What about the compensation? And on November 9, there was a statement that was issued which spoke to a compensation package of $115 million. And it's, somebody's mic is open. And it gave priority to 3 state agencies: NWC, NIC, and NEPA. And of that $115 million, only $16 million was given or was allocated to fisherfolk. And initially, if you look at the original statement, it was for only 70 fisherfolk. And we raised that concern with NEPA and the minister, and finally that number later increased to 122 after those discussions, and they have just been compensated last week. The compensation process just started last week. And the reason why it took some time was since that statement. Well, firstly, in just a few days before Christmas, the government issued what they call a release and discharge form. We were told that it was going to be a simple receipt that you signed for a form, you signed for the funds, but instead it was a release, and I should have actually put up the form on the screen. But basically it says, in order for me to accept this money, I accept that I cannot take further action against the government. I indemnify the government in order to receive these funds. But it also says you are clear to take action against any third parties. So in order for me to accept these funds, I have to basically, let me use that word. I have to indemnify the government or all government organizations, but I can take action against any third party. And we really believe that if enforcement action was stronger, and if the penalties were harsher, the penalties are $50,000 under the NRCA Act and $100,000 under the Wildlife Protection Act, it is unlikely that we would have seen the repeated abuse of the Rio Cobra that we have seen over the years. And we've heard about, and this takes me into looking at some of the weaknesses of the environmental regulatory framework. And I won't spend a lot of time here because we've heard about it in different ways, but I will touch on it. We've heard this from the senator as well. You know, the EIA is discretionary, which means that it's up to the NRCA. It's up to NRCA to decide whether or not an EIA needs to be done, and so it may or may not be required for a mine or a quarry application. In fact, several mining leases have not needed an EIA. This Windalco plant did not need an EIA, but to be fair, the EIA, the NRCA Act, this is from the 1950s, so there was no contemplation of this at the time. As I mentioned previously, the NRCA Act and the Wildlife Protection Act, which are the primary ones here, that in terms of monitoring and enforcing the environmental permit, they're weak or they're low. The fines are very low. And in terms of environmental monitoring and enforcement, one of the things that I want to add here, that apart from why it is also weak, is that there is very little independent verification of the data. So the bauxite mining, for example, they do their own dust air quality monitoring, but there's very little, and water quality monitoring, but there's very little independent monitoring of this. The Jamaica Bauxite Institute is supposed to do the independent monitoring. They do water quality quarterly monitoring of the industry, quarterly monitoring, and then they are to submit those reports. But when you look at those reports, which we've had the opportunity to receive following an ATI request, you see that there's a lot of repetition between the reports. There's very little how the issues are discussed. If you're not an expert in the industry, you'll not understand. And it glosses over a lot of the data and actually gives very little interpretation of some of the technical data. And so to say this, the institutional regulatory framework lies with multiple bodies, namely JBI and NEPA, but I actually should have included MGD, Mines and Geology, because they issue the mining licenses. Environmental monitoring, as I just mentioned, is done by JBI. There is an MOU. It has been in existence since the 1990s and revised in 2013. And there is a clear conflict here, right? Because JBI was developed to research and promote the industry, but they are also to regulate the industry as well. They're there to monitor the industry as well, which can create conflicts. We're actually in the process of doing a further deep dive into compensation and the whole weaknesses in relation to compensation. And so I touch on a few, but I'm not going to get into it. Some of the weaknesses, for example, how compensation is defined in the Mining Act is inadequate. It does not cover monetary and non-monetary compensation. It uses fair and reasonable compensation, but what is fair and reasonable compensation is not clearly defined. And it doesn't contain, the Act does not contain any special provisions for persons that are in bauxite areas who suffer from dust nuisance or water pollution as a result of the operation. As I mentioned earlier, some of the other weaknesses, we talk about lack of transparency in terms of getting information. You are in this community, you will not know what the permit says. And this goes for many other things unless you do an ATI request. The legislation and guidelines, they don't clearly and consistently require that water leaching or percolating waste dumps, tailings, and so forth are designed, built, or operated in alignment with best practice. And that's one of the things that we were concerned about in relation to Windalco, that this was not best practice. How they had designed the pond was not according to best practice. Was this considered? We don't know. We ask the questions, but we don't. We receive no response. There are other weaknesses, but I know that there were some. I knew that there were going to be some other presentations, and we heard some of these already spoken about. So I just picked on a few, and I'm only going to talk about a few recommendations because it's not enough to just talk about the weaknesses. It's important to look at some of the recommendations, and some of these recommendations we have highlighted in multiple studies. It comes out in our Red Dirt study, it came out in our review of the regulatory framework in relation to the mine and quarrying reg framework. And so some of these, and also in that most recent study that was done by Capri, and some of these recommendations look at strengthening the NRCA Act, looking at increasing fines and sanctions under these acts, including the Wildlife Protection Act, and along with several others, the Mining Act and so forth. Rationalizing and completing environmental policies, greater transparency and access to information. Let's just finalize and implement these EIA regulations, which we've heard have been in draft for forever. But importantly, we also need greater monitoring and enforcement and compliance. The EIA regulations should set out a variety of civil and criminal remedies, which the NRCA / NEPA can pursue where there is a breach of permits. And again, we speak about transparency and accountability. Legislation, I think Nastasia mentioned about payments and expenses. The legislation should require that all payments and expenses related to resettlement and compensation should be publicly disclosed. When you try to find out how much has been paid out in this compensation, or what I call dust money or nuisance money, you can't get that information. So you don't even know, and then you hear different accounts, different bauxite companies, different bauxite mine and alumina processing companies. You will hear some pay $500 per room, some pay $8,000 per month. You also get that's dust money, and some will get rent money for their land. And that, depending on your proximity to open mine, it could be $25,000 a month, it could be $12,000 a month. What is the thought process behind it? The process behind it is not governed by the legislation, because the legislation says fair and reasonable, which is not defined. And trying to get this information from the companies is next to impossible. Public participation and involvement in projects need improvement. So it's not just after an EIA is produced. In other jurisdictions, you'll see that public participation is encouraged from the terms of reference is being prepared. Rehabilitation procedures need to be improved. We heard, I think Nastasia was the one also that spoke about that. And Jade also mentioned about the inadequate rehabilitation. It needs to be improved, and reclamation standards also need to be improved. The case in point, when we look at the dirt, the amount of dirt that is required to be put back according to the procedures, it is not enough to support anything more than a couple of grasses and some cash crops. Can't support trees, tall trees, which are important, especially when we talk about the whole issue of climate change and building resilience in these communities. And we also need to support community capacity to obtain information to improve local environments. And I put this up here in case any of you are interested. This is Red Dirt, and what it does is that, especially in relation to the industry, it pulls out a lot of these things. It focuses on the regulatory framework. It focuses on the ecological impacts. It focuses on air quality. It has different chapters, which and then in the social costs, it also touches. It has a chapter that looks at social costs. So if you are interested in doing a deeper dive than what we've heard here today, please feel free. It's on our website at jamandtrust.org. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too fast. Dave?
Okay, thanks so much, Teresa. It was very engaging for me. I don't think you went too fast at all.
Okay,
so
good.
I am leaving a minute or two for persons to raise any questions that they may have. You can just quickly put it in the chat or raise your hand and ask the question. Just looking out, no one. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I did see a comment while you were presenting from Jennifer Jones that was stating that a healthy environment is important for sustainable economies, and so it is related to economic development. And I can agree with that. It is related to economic development. Okay, so thank you, Teresa, for joining us. Hold on, I'm seeing a question now. From Joshua Anderson, he says, given the slow nature of the legislative process, what do you think the government of Jamaica's next steps should be?
I really think that, as I had mentioned in one of my slides, yeah, we understand the issues related to creating new laws and so forth. And so that's why it's very important that we think about, we look at how we monitor and enforce. It has a lot of challenges. Even the whole process of making complaints as a community member, how if we, and I'm sure JFJ, you have this issue as well. Communities will say, I've called NEPA, I've made a complaint and nothing happens. And so they reach out to us and say, can you help us to amplify? And it should not be that way. If you have a complaint, if you think that your the company that is working nearby is in violation of its permit, you should be able to make a complaint and be rest assured that NEPA will act, will react, will check it out, and will respond to you with the action that has been taken. I think also that one of the other things that shouldn't take much time to do is just the transparency aspect of things. So making permits available online. If you go on NEPA's website, only permit that you will find online is SML 173. And that's because in all of these decisions and all of the advocacy around the concerns about SML 173, that's one of the things that we asked. Can you please put the permits online so that it can be available for the public? But it shouldn't just be one permit. It should be all permits. It should be all documents. Of course, if there's something that it might be proprietary in relation to a design, then I can understand why they wouldn't want to put that in there. But if there are studies, not just the EIA, there are many other projects there are many other developments that take place on a that are approved regularly, monthly, that did not require an EIA, but do require some sort of assessment. The public should have access to that. The public should understand how rigorous the study was done, and if any kind of consideration was given to certain issues. As Jade mentioned, I think the community knows best. The community understands their surroundings best, and so they need to play a role, not just in the EIA process, but just generally speaking. Anything that involves a decision around a development should involve the community. So those are just two things that I would say that we would definitely need to focus on in the immediate, and wouldn't take too much resources, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Moody. Are there any other questions? Okay, it doesn't seem as if we have any questions. All right, we have come to the end of our workshop. So we're asking you to complete a survey that will pop up shortly. It should come up shortly. As Jade mentioned earlier, if you're interested in working with JFJ, you can contact me at vparkinson. I'm going to put it in the chat at jamaicans4justice.org. So it's in the chat for you. Okay, thank you everyone for joining this workshop. Sorry about that. Thanks everyone for joining this workshop, and I trust that you found it very interesting and informative. Thank you, Ms. Jackson, for highlighting the work of JFJ, and Jade for organizing this workshop and for her presentation. Thank you to our communications officer for his technical support, that's Mr. Brown. And last but not least, I thank you to the presenters. Special thanks to the presenters, Senator Fraser Binns, Dr. Moody, and Ms. Robinson. Oh, someone is saying that it's not opening. Let me check on that.
Once the session ends, it should be available to everyone.
Okay. So have a good rest of the day, everyone, and thanks again for joining.